Okay, you don't know it obviously on YouTube, but this is take two because I accidentally hit the record button to shut it off while I was trying to hold the light with my hand. So let's try this again. So I'm just giving an update on my solar system setup. Previous video showed all the collectors. Now I showed you this tank here when it was apart, and I told you I had to do some repairs to it. It had a small leak. Here it is all repaired. And I actually got it partly tied in. I'll cover that in a minute. And then I have an additional tank here for additional storage. I do apologize for the tight quarters in the shaken video because it is really tight in this hall area down in my basement where all my plumbing and stuff comes into the house. Let me just back up here and kind of give you an overall of the setup here, and then I'll get into a little bit more detail. And again, I'm going a little more detail than I found on YouTube, so if anybody wanted to duplicate this, they could. So here's my existing boiler, which heats my house currently, as well as my existing hot water heater. Okay? And it's very simple. Obviously, the water comes into the water heater over here, and then obviously gets heated and goes back out. So what I wanted to do was to preheat the water, use my solar collector, store it in these tanks here, and send it to the inlet of this tank here, so it's already hot coming into here. This is a standard setup as far as that goes. People do that so if there's no solar for a few days and your water starts to cool down in these tanks, it's going through this original tank anyways, and then the boiler would just kick in and heat the water, so you're never without hot water. Now I did set mine up a little bit different because I have a dual tank set up here. So normally you would have just one tank, and I'll explain that setup here really quick and then show you what I did to hook in an additional tank. And again, I do apologize for the tight space. I'm going to try to sit down here low and do a little zooming because I am kind of cramped in here. So that T right there is the in from the cold. Comes in after my filter and all that, and from there goes to a valve, of course, so I can shut it on or off, so I can do work on the system if need be. It's all in PEX at that point. Let me just zoom back out. The PEX comes down, and this is where I messed up last time, trying to hold the camera and the light with the same hand. Let's do this. So it's coming in here, cold comes in, it's going over into the base of the tank, will be eventually heated in here, and then will leave the tank through the hot water outlet at the top, that pipe where you see the elbow right there. Okay? So that's a normal setup. And then of course that will go, that pipe leaving here hot will go into the cold feed to my original boiler. I mean my original hot water heater. So if it ever wasn't being heated by the solar panels, it would be heated up in there before it got to us upstairs anyways. Now what I've done is to add more capacity is I put a second tank in, which you kind of saw when I stood back. This is an electric water tank, which I'm not using the electric part of it at all. As you can see, it's taken apart, and the insulation is pulled off this one as well. Eventually will go back on. So back to where the water came in, it comes in, and as you can see, it tees off at the bottom here. I get that light to sit there. It goes in the bottom of this tank, like I explained to you earlier, but also goes over and comes up and goes into the bottom of the second tank. And then of course off to the side here I have a boiler drain at the lowest point, so if I have to drain this system and do any work I can. So that's how I got them tied together at the feed end. So when cold comes in, I have the cold deliberately coming in at the lowest point and with less elbows to go into this water heater. And the reason for that is this is the one that will be heated by the panel. You can see I have the return to the solar panel, which would normally go to your boiler. And then this up here is from the solar panel. The glycol will come in hot to the coil, heat the water inside this tank, return back to the solar collector, and of course make a continuous loop heating up this hot water. Okay, and so obviously I want the coldest water in here first to get it warm before it moves around. Now let's go to the top of the tank so I can explain to you a little bit of that setup here. As you can see, I have coming out of that one is your hot that normally would come out in any normal setup. It goes over and to this T here, but if this T wasn't here, this would be a normal setup. It'd go up to a valve or whatever, and then of course this goes over, and eventually I'll take you over there so you can see, goes right to here, and then it goes down to the feed of my original water heater. So I'm bypassing the old feed, but it's still here, so if I have to still use it, I can turn this back on, shut this system off, and I can still use the original setup just the way it is, just by throwing 3 valves. But currently the water is going through the solar tanks, even though the solar panel is not hooked up. Okay, and then to show the top, how I have it tied into the second tank and how that's working. So here's a pretty good view of it here. You can see it goes up, it tees, and goes into the top of this tank. So the theory behind this is I'm using a thermal siphoning setup to move the water from one tank to the other. Hence why the tank that will be doing the heating is at the lowest point, because I want the coldest water in that tank so it can be heated by the solar system. So essentially, if it works the way I want it to, which it should, no problem, is the cold water will come in. It's going to come into this tank first because it's the lowest, and of course cold wants to stay down, heat wants to rise. There is less elbows and corners for the water to come in and go that way than it is to go this way. There's an additional elbow, so that'll slow down the feed to this tank, thus forcing more of the cold into that tank, right where I want it, right where this coil is. So that's where we want it. As it heats, it's going to rise up in this tank. And eventually, obviously, the hotter it gets, it's rising to the top. Now if it gets hot enough, it's going to come out through this pipe, even though we're not calling for water upstairs, because thermal siphon, it's going to want to equal itself out and have all the hot water at the top. And since the tanks are hooked together in a loop, it's going to want to come over and go down into the top of this tank, thus pushing the cold water that is in this tank to the base of this tank and out here. So if no one's calling for water, no water's coming in, but this can make a loop and then back in to the bottom and to be reheated. That's why this tank is quite a bit higher. So if you think about it in like 4 sections, as far as heat goes, in the height of the heat or the water levels, if I stand back here, I might get a better view. This top portion, and again I do apologize for the shaky video, I am in tight quarters. You just hook the light like that. So break both these tanks down into 4 sections, and you can see the other tank levels right there. So this top section right here of this black tank closest to us should have the hottest water in it. Okay? And then from here, the top of this, that second tank and this one down maybe a quarter should have hot, warm to hot water in it. And then from there to the bottom of this black tank should have cool water. And notice where the level is at the other tank. It's at the top of the coil inside that tank. So from the top of that coil to the base of that tank should be the coldest water. Right where we want it, right at the coil. So the coil and the water, the glycol mix coming from the collector, will heat that. And then again, just complete that cycle. So that's the only thing that's not hooked up in here at the moment. And of course, there'll be more to come on that later. So that's how that works. Then if you notice, up top here, you might have noticed, on this setup, maybe not so much from this angle, and I've got my wire wrapped around the board here so I can't get close. If I angle the camera right, this comes out of the top here like we explained earlier and out of the top of the other tank, but I have the hot coming out going to the water heater, the original one, into the house, closest to this tank, which is where we said the hottest water should be, in the top quarter of this tank. So, being how it's closer to this tank, when you start drawing on it, it's going to have an easier path coming up and out of this tank first, thus getting the hottest of the hot water. And it'll go up, out through there, over where I showed you earlier, right to there, and down and feed this tank. And if the solar system is working fine, everything's hot enough, this tank, depending on what we have the setting at, won't ever kick the boiler on to heat it. It'll already be plenty hot enough. So that is the general setup. And you can probably see I have some wires over there. That's part of the collector. So I have my that's part of the control unit. I have that. I just don't have it hooked up yet. So that is where we're at. And I am going to probably draw a diagram of this to put it online as well, because it is such tight quarters here it's hard to see. But if you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to leave a message or ask a question. I might be able to explain a little bit better, or maybe take a still shot or something of the setup. So that's it for now, and we will talk to you later.